Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever is beneath you. Feel the weight of your limbs, heavy and warm. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it gently for just a moment and release it slowly through your mouth. Again, breathe in and out. With every breath, your body becomes heavier. With every word you hear, your mind drifts further from the noise of the day. There is nothing you need to do right now. No problem to solve. No tomorrow to plan for. Just this moment. Just this story. Tonight, I am going to take you somewhere ancient. Somewhere that exists only in the space between history and dream. A world of crashing waves and white marble temples. Of gods who move like storms through the sky. Of monsters who were not always monsters. And of stories so old, they have been forgotten by almost everyone. Almost. Close your eyes. Let your breath slow. And follow me back. Back to the beginning, to a time before cities, before maps, before the world had edges that anyone had found. To a world called Greece, to a story called Medusa. Before we speak of Medusa, we must speak of the sea, because everything in this story begins with the sea. The Mediterranean in the old world was not simply water. It was alive. The ancient Greeks believed the sea had a soul, that beneath its surface moved creatures and gods and memories older than any mountain. The waves were its breathing, the storms were its anger, the calm on those rare blue mornings when the surface lay still as glass was its contentment. And deep beneath all of it, in the coldest, darkest corridors of the ocean floor, lived beings who had existed since before the gods of Olympus were born. They were called the primordial ones, the first things, the ancestors of everything. Among them was Phorcys, ancient god of the hidden dangers of the deep, a being so old that even Zeus, king of all gods, spoke his name carefully. Phorcys had the upper body of a man and the lower body of a fish, his skin the color of sea foam, his eyes the pale gray of deep water on a cloudy day. He moved through the ocean floor the way a slow current moves, unhurried, inevitable. His wife was Ceto, goddess of sea monsters and strange creatures. She was enormous and ancient and beautiful in the way that terrifying things can sometimes be beautiful, like a hurricane seen from a great distance, like lightning over an open ocean. Together, Phorcys and Ceto had many children, strange and wondrous and terrible children. The gray, 3 sisters who shared one eye and one tooth between them, passing them back and forth in wrinkled hands, peering at the world through a single clouded lens. The Hesperides, nymphs of the evening, who tended a garden at the edge of the world where golden apples grew. The Ladon, a dragon who never slept, coiled endlessly around the tree of golden apples, his scales catching the last light of every sunset. And then there were 3 more daughters, 3 sisters so different from anything else that had ever existed, that even the gods paused when they heard their names: Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, the Gorgons. Stheno and Euryale were immortal. They would exist as long as the sea existed, as long as stars burned, as long as darkness had a name. But Medusa was mortal, born into a family of eternal things. She carried within her the one thing none of them could ever fully understand: an ending, a fixed point somewhere in the future where she would simply stop. No one in her family spoke of it, but everyone knew. And perhaps that is why Medusa was the most beautiful of them all. Perhaps beauty is always sharpest, most luminous, most impossible to look away from. When it is temporary, she grew up at the edge of the sea, Her childhood was the sound of waves. Her playground was the rocky shoreline where the ocean met the land, where tide pools collected small, bright creatures, where seabirds called to each other across the gray morning sky. She and her sisters would sit on the rocks for hours, watching the water, watching the ships in the distance, watching the world beyond the shoreline that they had not yet explored. Stano was fierce. Even as a young girl, she moved with the certainty of someone who knew they could not be harmed. Uriele was wild. She laughed loudly and swam far out into deep water without fear. But Medusa was still. She would sit on the highest rock she could find and simply look at the horizon, at the light changing on the water as the hours passed, at the way a single cloud could shift the color of the entire sea from turquoise to gray in a matter of minutes. She was always watching, always thinking, always feeling more than she knew how to say. Word of Medusa's beauty spread the way all impossible things spread. Slowly at first, a fisherman returns to port and tells his wife about the girl he saw on the rocks near the northern shore. The one with the golden hair and the face that made him forget, for a full 10 minutes, which way was home. His wife tells her sister. Her sister tells the woman at the market. The woman at the market mentions it to a merchant who is passing through. The merchant carries the story south, and further south still, until the story has traveled so far from its source that Medusa herself has become something else entirely. A legend, a rumor, something men argue about in taverns. She cannot possibly be that beautiful, some said. No mortal woman is. But others had seen her, and they had nothing to say. Because there are no words for certain things. There is no description adequate for a sunrise seen from the top of a mountain after 3 days of rain. There is no language sufficient for the first time you hear a piece of music that makes your chest crack open. And there were no words for Medusa's face. Sailors were the ones most affected. The sea route along the northern coast passed close to the rocky shore where Medusa spent her days, and sailors began to reroute their journeys just to pass that stretch of coastline. They would slow their ships, stand at the bow, shield their eyes against the sun and search the rocks. And sometimes, if the light was right and the sea was calm, they would see her, sitting on her rock, hair catching the wind, face turned slightly toward the horizon. And every single one of them would feel the same thing. A stillness in the center of their chest, like the world had paused, like time had taken a breath. And then she would turn, and if she happened to glance at the ship, the sailors would lose their ability to speak for several minutes. They would simply stand there, breathing, until the ship had passed the rocks and the coastline curved away and she was gone. And they would look at each other and shake their heads slowly, and no one would say anything because there was nothing to say. Medusa knew she was beautiful. It is impossible not to know when the world reflects it back to you constantly. But she did not particularly care about it. Beauty had always felt like something that happened to her, not something she had chosen or created. Like the weather, like the color of the sea. It simply was. What she cared about was something else entirely. She had begun to feel the first stirrings of a question that would define the rest of her life. What am I for? Not what am I? Not how beautiful am I? But what am I for? What is the purpose of this life, this temporary mortal life, in a family of eternal beings? What am I supposed to do with the time I have? She would sit on her rock and ask the sea. The sea did not answer. She would ask the stars at night. The stars burned on indifferently. She would ask her sisters. Stheno laughed. Euryale shrugged. And so Medusa kept asking and waiting for an answer that would eventually find her in a city of white marble, at the top of a great hill, inside a temple that smelled of olive wood and sacred fire. Medusa left the sea when she was still young. She said goodbye to her sisters on the rocky shore. Stheno gripped her arm and held it for a long moment, said nothing, let go. Euryale hugged her fiercely and then turned away before Medusa could see her face. Medusa walked south. The journey took many days. She walked through pine forests where the light came down in long golden shafts through the branches, where the ground was soft with fallen needles, where deer watched her from between the trees with their large, dark, patient eyes. She walked through mountain passes where the wind cut cold and sharp, and the rock walls on either side rose so high that only a thin strip of sky was visible above her. She walked through small villages where people stopped what they were doing to stare at her. She had learned to keep her eyes slightly downcast when she walked through populated places. Not from shyness, but because she had discovered that direct eye contact with her, sustained eye contact, made people lose their thoughts entirely. They would stand with their mouths slightly open, forgetting what they had been doing, forgetting what they had been about to say. And she found this exhausting. She did not want to be something that made people forget themselves. She wanted to be somewhere she could forget herself, somewhere she could be useful, somewhere she could belong to something larger than her own beauty. And then she came over the last hill and saw Athens below her. She stopped walking. The city spread out across the plain like something dreamed rather than built. White stone catching the afternoon light. The sound of the agora drifting up on the warm air. Voices and commerce and the smell of bread and olive oil and animals. And rising above all of it, on the highest point of the city, the Acropolis. And on top of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, Temple of Athena. Even from this distance, it was extraordinary. The columns seemed to glow. The light around it was different from the light anywhere else in the city. Warmer, more concentrated, as if the sun itself was paying particular attention to that one spot. Medusa felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been waiting her whole life to be found. She walked down into the city, through the agora with her eyes downcast, through the winding streets that led upward toward the Acropolis, up the long stone steps, and into the shadow of the temple. She stood at the entrance for a long time. The columns towered above her. The air smelled of incense and cold stone, and something older than either of those things. Something that had no name but felt like being exactly where you were supposed to be. There were priestesses moving quietly through the temple interior, tending the sacred flame, arranging offerings, sweeping the stone floors with slow, careful strokes. Medusa watched them, and then she did something she had never done before in her life. She knelt, not because anyone asked her to, not because of protocol or tradition, but because her legs simply bent beneath her, as if her body understood something her mind was still catching up to. She pressed her forehead to the cool stone floor, and she made a vow. "Goddess of wisdom," she whispered, "I have been given a face that the world cannot stop looking at. I do not want to be looked at. I want to be useful. I want to serve something real. Let me serve you. Let me be part of something that matters. The flame at the center of the temple flared briefly, just once, and then settled back to its steady burn. Medusa lifted her head and began to learn the rhythms of the temple. She swept the floors before dawn, while the city still slept below. She arranged the olive branches and pomegranates that worshippers brought as offerings. She tended the sacred fire, never letting it go out, watching it through the long, quiet nights with patient eyes. She learned the prayers, the rituals, the names of each goddess form, and what each represented. The other priestesses were cautious with her at first. Her beauty made them uncomfortable in the same way it made everyone uncomfortable. But over weeks, over months, something changed. They began to see past the face. They began to see Medusa, the quietness of her, the steadiness, the way she never complained about any task, no matter how small, the way she listened when someone spoke to her, fully, completely, as if what they were saying was the most important thing in the world. She became one of them. She became part of the temple. And for the first time in her life, Medusa felt peace. Years passed inside the temple. Good years, quiet years. Years that stacked gently on top of each other like the pages of a book being written slowly, carefully, with attention paid to every word. Medusa was no longer the girl who had walked down from the hill with wide eyes and a longing she couldn't name. She was a priestess, respected, known, loved in the quiet way that temples love their most devoted servants. But outside the temple, the world continued to move, and the gods continued to watch. It was on a warm afternoon in late summer, the kind of afternoon where the air is thick with heat, and even the birds are too tired to sing. That Poseidon came to Athens, god of the sea, brother of Zeus and Hades, ruler of all water, ocean and river and rain, and the water that moves underground through the roots of mountains. He was ancient. He was enormous, not always in physical size, but in the way that powerful things are enormous, in the space they take up in a room, in the way the air changes when they enter it. He had come to Athens disguised as a mortal man. This was common for the gods. They moved among humans for their own reasons: curiosity, boredom, hunger for something they could not name precisely but recognized when they saw it. Poseidon walked through the agora, through the streets, up toward the Acropolis. He was not particularly interested in Athena's temple. He and Athena had a complicated history. There had been a contest once for the patronage of this city. Poseidon had struck the ground with his trident and produced a saltwater spring. Athena had planted an olive tree. The people had chosen the olive tree. Poseidon had not forgotten this, but something drew him up the steps anyway. Some current he couldn't identify, like a tide pulling towards something it hadn't seen yet but already knew. He entered the temple and saw Medusa. She was sweeping the far end of the hall, her back partially turned, moving with the slow rhythm of someone completely absorbed in what they were doing. The late afternoon light came through the temple columns and fell across her in long, warm bands. Poseidon stopped walking. In all his centuries of existence, and he had existed since before the world had its current shape, he had never felt what he felt in that moment: a complete stopping of everything, thought, movement, the low constant hum of divine power that always moved through him like a current. All of it stopped. He stood and stared, and wanted. Poseidon was not accustomed to wanting things he could not have. He was a god. He was one of the three most powerful beings in existence. The concept of restraint was not something he had ever needed to develop. He wanted, and so he moved toward what he wanted. What happened inside the temple of Athena that afternoon cannot be described fully here. Some stories are told in the space between words, in what is not said, in the silence that falls when certain things are named. Medusa called out. Her voice echoed off the marble walls and the high stone ceiling. She called for her goddess. She called for Athena. She called for anyone. But the temple was quiet. The sacred flame burned on steadily. The stone did not move, and no one came. When it was over, when Poseidon had taken what he had come for and left, Medusa lay on the cold stone floor of the temple she had given years of her life to serving. The floor she had swept 1,000 times before dawn. The floor she had pressed her forehead to in devotion. She lay there for a long time. The flame at the center of the temple burned. The light through the columns shifted as the sun moved. The sounds of the city drifted up from below. And Medusa did not move when Athena returned to her temple that evening. She knew immediately. Gods always know. They feel the disturbance in sacred spaces the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. A pressure shift, a change in the quality of the air. Her temple had been violated. She stood at the entrance and felt her rage rise. It was the kind of rage that is also grief, the kind that comes when something you love has been damaged, and you cannot undo the damage. She walked through the temple, found Medusa still on the floor, still, shaking slightly. The rage in Athena built to something enormous, something that needed to go somewhere, needed a target. Here is where the story becomes cruel. Here is where it becomes the kind of story that has made people uncomfortable for thousands of years. Because Athena did not turn her rage toward Poseidon, she could not. He was her equal in power, her uncle, an Olympian god protected by laws older than the gods themselves. To strike at Poseidon was to start a war that would crack the world open. And so, she looked down at Medusa, and in her grief and rage, and the horrible helplessness of divine power that still has limits, she chose a different target. There are scholars who have argued about this for centuries. Some say Athena was jealous of Medusa's beauty and used this moment as an excuse. Some say she was cursing Medusa to protect her, making her monstrous so that no god or man would ever want to come near her again. Some say she was simply doing what powerful beings have always done when they cannot reach the source of their pain. She aimed at what she could reach, whatever her reasons. Athena raised her hand and spoke the curse. The change was not instantaneous. It moved through Medusa slowly, like something waking up that had always been sleeping beneath the surface. Her golden hair began to move first, each strand lifting, separating, twisting, darkening from gold to black, to the deep green black of deep water at night, and then thickening and dividing and becoming something else entirely. Serpents. They emerged from her scalp the way roots emerge from a seed, not violently but inevitably, as if they had always been there waiting. They coiled and uncoiled in the air around her head, testing the temperature, tasting with their tongues, their scales catching the firelight in shifting patterns of gold and bronze and shadow. There were dozens of them. They hissed softly, and then went quiet, as if they recognized her, as if they had always known her. Medusa reached up with trembling hands and felt the first serpent that brushed against her fingers. Its scales were smooth and warm. It turned and regarded her with small, bright eyes, and did not strike. She lowered her hands to her face, felt her own features, still the same. But her eyes had changed. She could feel it without seeing it. A new weight behind them, a new depth. She looked up at Athena, and Athena looked away. From that day forward, anyone who looked directly into Medusa's eyes would turn to stone, not slowly, not painfully, simply stone. Gray and cold and permanent. A statue where a person had been. A perfect frozen moment where a life had been. Medusa stood in the temple and understood what she had become. She did not scream. She did not beg. She looked at the sacred flame burning in the center of the room. She looked at the offerings she had arranged that morning. The olive branches, the pomegranates. And then she walked out of the temple and did not look back. She could not go back to the sea. Her family was there, and she could not risk it. One moment of eye contact, one accidental glance at her beloved sisters, and they would be stoned forever. She could not go back to Athens. She could not go anywhere near people. She walked south first, through the olive groves that she had always loved. The way they smelled in the heat of the afternoon, something green and clean and ancient. She kept her eyes on the ground in front of her. She had always done this in crowds. She had always been careful. But now careful had a different weight to it. Now careful meant the difference between a world with people in it and a world of statues. She passed through small villages at night when everyone was sleeping. She moved like shadow, like the space between stars. She found she could travel the rocky hillsides in the dark almost as easily as in the light. The serpents on her head seemed to sense obstacles before she reached them. They would shift and orient in a particular direction, and she had learned, quickly, to trust their direction. They were, she was beginning to understand, not a punishment, or not only a punishment, they were also companions, the only ones she had left. She talked to them sometimes in the long, dark hours of walking. She told them about the sea, about her sisters, about the temple and the sound of the sacred fire and the smell of olive wood burning at dusk. They listened with their small, bright eyes. They did not offer comfort. But they were there, and there, it turned out, was enough. The landscape changed around her as she walked further south and then west. The terrain became rockier, the trees more sparse, the light more bleached and pale. She was moving toward the edge, toward the place the ancient Greeks called the ends of the earth, the boundary where the known world faded into something else, something unnamed and unmapped, where the living land slid into shadow. She recognized it when she reached it, not because of any landmark, but because of the feeling, the specific quality of the silence there. It was a silence that had no end, not the silence of a sleeping city or a quiet forest, or even the deep ocean in calm weather. This was the silence of a place that had never been loud, that had existed in this stillness since before there were ears to hear it. She found the cave on the third day. It was carved into a cliff face at the edge of a dark sea that was different from the sea she had grown up beside. Her childhood sea had been blue and changeable and full of life. This sea was the color of iron, flat, still, indifferent. The cave entrance was low but widened quickly inside. The stone walls were smooth and cold. The floor was dark sand. At the back of the cave, the sound of the sea outside became a low, constant hum. like breathing, like the slow respiration of something very large and very old. Medusa walked to the back of the cave, sat down, and for the first time since leaving the temple, she stopped. She sat in the darkness and the cool air and the low, endless sound of the distant sea. The serpent settled around her head like a crown of living things finding their rest. She breathed, in and out, and something inside her, something that had been clenched since that afternoon in the temple, began, very slowly, to unclench. She was somewhere no one could find her. She was somewhere no one would be accidentally turned to stone by her existence. She was out of the world that had no place for her. And in the darkness and the cold and the silence, she found something she had not expected to find. Quiet. Not happiness. Not peace exactly. But quiet. The absence of the constant, exhausting work of being seen, of being beautiful, of managing what her face did to the world around her. Here, in the dark, with only serpents for company, she could simply be. Time moves differently in exile. Without the rhythm of a city, without bells marking the hours and seasons marked by festivals and the planting and harvesting of crops, time becomes something more like water. It moves. But you cannot always tell how fast or in which direction. Medusa marked time by the serpents. They had moods, she discovered. On certain mornings they were alert and curious, lifting their heads and tasting the air, as if something interesting was happening somewhere out of reach. On other days they were languid and warm, and pressed themselves close to her scalp like living warmth. She learned their individual personalities. The largest one, the one who always coiled at the front of her head and seemed to be in charge, she called Thalassa. After the sea, he was calm and watchful and rarely moved unless he had to. There was a smaller one near her left ear that she called Helios, because it was always trying to find patches of sunlight and orient toward them. And there was a young one, the smallest, that coiled near the back of her neck and slept more than the others, and occasionally made a sound that was almost like a contented sigh. She never named the young one. She did not want to love it too much. She had already lost too many things she loved. She learned the cave the way you learn any home, the places where the stone was smoothest and best for sleeping, the small spring at the back that trickled cold, clear water down a channel in the rock, the angle of the cave entrance that meant the light came in for exactly 2 hours every morning, falling in a long, narrow band across the sand floor. She would sit in that band of light with her eyes closed, feel it on her face. This she still had, the warmth of sunlight, the smell of rain, the sound of the sea. These things had not been taken from her. She was grateful for them in a way she had never been grateful for anything before. Because gratitude, she was learning, is sharpest when you understand what it is to lose things. She did not know how many years passed. The seasons came and the seasons went. The cave was cold in winter and cool in summer. The sea outside was never warm. Sometimes travelers passed along the cliff path above her cave. She could hear their voices, fragments of conversation carried down on the wind. She would press herself against the cave wall and hold very still and wait until the voices faded. She did not want to be found. She did not want to harm anyone. She simply wanted to exist in the quiet space she had made for herself at the edge of the world. Was she lonely? Yes. Of course she was lonely. Loneliness is not something you can simply decide to stop feeling because your circumstances make solitude necessary. She missed her sisters with a specific ache that never fully went away. She missed the temple, the sound of the other priestesses moving through the halls before dawn, the smell of the sacred fire, the feeling of purpose that had filled her life there. She missed the sea of her childhood. She even missed, and this surprised her, the sailors who used to slow their ships to look at her. Not the looking, but the evidence in the looking that she was part of a world that noticed her, that she existed in relation to other things. Here, in the cave, she existed only in relation to stone and sand and cold water and the sea. She was still here, but she was no longer in the world. She thought about this often in the long, dark hours. The difference between existing and being part of something. She thought about Athena. She thought about Poseidon. She did not feel the rage she might have expected to feel. She felt something quieter than rage, something that had no good name in any language she knew. A deep tiredness, a long sadness, a resignation that was not acceptance but was what you arrived at when acceptance was still too far away. Far to the north, in the kingdom of Argos, a young man named Perseus was being sent to his death. He did not know this yet. He thought he was being given an opportunity, a chance to prove himself, a quest. Perseus was the son of Zeus, though he had grown up without knowing this, raised by his mother Danae on the small island of Seriphos, where they had washed ashore in a wooden chest when Perseus was still a baby. The king of Seriphos was named Polydectes. He wanted Danae, and Perseus, protective, proud, young enough to believe that bravery was the same as invincibility, stood in his way. Polydectes knew exactly how to move a proud young man out of the way. You make him a promise. You tell him he is special. You tell him there is a task that only he is capable of. And then you point him towards something impossible. Bring me the head of Medusa, Polydectes told him. Perseus said yes. He said yes the way young men have always said yes to impossible things. Immediately, without thinking, fueled by the specific fire of wanting to prove yourself to someone who has underestimated you. But the gods were watching. Athena came to Perseus first. She gave him a shield polished to a mirror finish so perfect that it showed everything around him in perfect reflection. You cannot look at Medusa directly, she told him. Use the shield. See only her reflection, never her face. Hermes came next. He gave Perseus winged sandals that let him fly, and a sword of adamantine sharp enough to cut through anything. Perseus found the gray on a cold gray cliff above a cold gray sea. 3 ancient sisters who shared one eye and one tooth between them. He waited until the eye was being passed between 2 of them and snatched it. They wailed and bargained. He told them what he wanted. Reluctantly, furiously, they told him where Medusa lived. He gave back the eye. From the gray, he was directed to the nymphs of the north, who gave him a leather satchel enchanted to carry the head safely, and the helm of Hades, the cap of invisibility. Perseus put on the winged sandals, rose into the air, and flew south, over mountains capped in white, over rivers that wound through dark valleys like silver thread, over the deep blue expanse of the sea. He flew until the landscape below him changed, until the world became spare and rocky, and the quality of the light shifted to something bleached and thin. He descended slowly, found the cliff, found the cave entrance. He put on the helm of Hades and disappeared. He moved toward the cave. His sandals barely touched the ground. And then he heard it. From inside the cave, the soft rhythmic sound of something sleeping, the slow hiss of serpents at rest. And beneath that, so quiet he almost missed it, the sound of breathing, human breathing, slow and deep and tired, the kind of breathing that comes after years of being alone. He raised his shield, angled it until he could see the cave interior reflected in its surface. And there, in the dim light of the cave, curled against the far wall, with serpents draped gently around her head like a sleeping crown, was Medusa. She was smaller than he had expected. She looked in the reflection like someone who had simply gotten very tired a long time ago and had not quite managed to get back up. He moved forward. His sword hand was steady. His heart was not. He had been told she was a monster. He had not been told that monsters could look, in the reflection of a shield, like someone simply sleeping. But he had a mother to protect, and a quest he had said yes to. And so Perseus raised his sword, and with one swift motion, it was done. The serpents went still, all of them. At once, the cave went quiet, and from the blood that fell to the dark sand of the cave floor, two things were born: a giant warrior, fully armed, rising from the earth, Chrysaor, and a horse, white, with wings folded against its sides like a sleeping bird. The wings unfolded slowly. They were enormous. They filled the cave. The horse, Pegasus, shook his head once, stamped one hoof on the sand, and then rose, up through the cave entrance, into the pale sky, a single white shape against the gray, getting smaller and smaller and gone. Perseus placed the head in the satchel with careful hands and flew away from the cave, away from the edge of the world. And so ends the story of Medusa, a girl who became a priestess, who became a monster, who became a myth, who was remembered only for how she died, and never for how she lived, or for what was taken from her. But you know now, you know the whole story. And somewhere, in the place where old stories go when no one tells them anymore, maybe that is enough. The sea is quiet tonight. The stars are out. The serpents are still. And you are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. Let your body sink deeper into rest. Let your thoughts drift like clouds across a dark sky, slow and heavy and far away. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nothing you need to figure out. Nothing you need to remember. Just breathe and rest, and let the old world fade. Good night.